Hey everybody, Dr. Ackerson here. I know this is a video, but you're only going to get audio because there's nothing to look at other than me sitting there talking, and there's no reason to look at that. I wanted to follow up on what you read last week. Of course, you read about Aryan society last time, and one of the things that people often associate with India, either modern or ancient, is the caste system, and people are fascinated by it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. And I should tell you, this will be split up into a couple of different parts so I can upload it onto YouTube, which is the easiest way for me to deal with this. So anyway, the caste system really starts out as a way for the Aryans to differentiate between Aryans and non-Aryans. The Aryans moved into India. The locals were a little more dark complected, and so it was obvious who was who. So Aryans were a little bit lighter skinned. They weren't white, but they were lighter skinned because they came from Central Asia. So early on, it was easy to tell who was who because you could just look at the person and tell what their background was. But once the Aryans started to settle down, some of those lines blurred, either accidentally or purposefully or whatever. And so Aryans, who were very, I guess, sort of self-sensitive, created the caste system. And as time goes on, Aryan society was divided into four classes, or what are called Varnas. And those four are Brahmans, who originally were the priests and their most important group, Kshatriya, who were the warriors, Vaishya, who were the commoners, and the Shudra, who were mostly locals who were not Aryans. Now there's also a fifth unrecognized class, and they're the ones given the lowliest jobs and the worst duties and so on, such as scavenging, handling dead bodies, anything to do with dead bodies or meat or flesh or hides or anything like that. All those things were considered unclean tasks, and they were considered so unclean that the person doing them was unclean and thus was untouchable. And so we have this fifth informal group until just recently when untouchables were sort of formalized, but traditionally it's an informal, unrecognized group. Untouchables had to live away from the village. They were not allowed to draw water from the village well. They can't eat with other members of other groups. Later on, they were not able to enter a Hindu temple. So a lot of very serious restrictions were placed on them. Only people belonging to the first three groups could participate in religious rituals. Only they could be educated. And education was done through instruction in religious texts. Basically what this means then is really over 50% of the population, which is the Shudra and the untouchables, over 50% of the population could not be educated by traditional law. And like I said, this system originates in the Aryan prejudice against their almost certainly darker skinned neighbors. And there's even remnants of this in India today because a lot of parents in India still try to find a quote-unquote fair-skinned bride for their sons. And if they have daughters, they will advertise their daughters as the color of wheat or a lighter complexion because those women are seen as more desirable because they're lighter complexion. Well, it doesn't take long before that Brahmin caste becomes even more important, and only they're allowed to perform religious rituals. By the time we get to around 300 BC, so we're talking about 2,000 or 1,000 years, 1,000 years for this to fall into place. By the time we get to around 300 BC, divisions within those Varna emerge based on occupation, lineage, and so on. And these divisions are what are called Jati. And the Jati is what we normally call castes. We don't really know that much about how the castes were actually formed. It's probably very complicated anyway. But basically the Jatis were and are, because the system is still in place, they're groups representing special distinctions within the Varna. So for example, if we look at the Shudra class, carpenters are in there, barbers are in there, weavers are in there. They're all members of that Varna, but they have their own separate Jati. Sometimes new Jati could be formed when there's a new occupation. Intermarriage between members of different Varna was generally frowned upon, but when it did happen, it might create a new Jati. And it was possible for a group or a group of families to be downgraded or degraded within their Varna for not performing their religious rituals. So that might create a new Jati, which would be lower down in the Varna. Sometimes a foreign tribe would be absorbed as they moved in. Sometimes more locals were brought in. So very, very complicated system. And within the Varnas, there's over 3,000 castes. Each one has its own name. It has its own rules of conduct. And these Jati rules govern family life. They govern social life in traditional Indian society. Well, every Hindu belongs to a group of families that share a common lineage, which is called a Gotra, and that traces its descent from some sort of mythical ancestor. In other words, everybody within that Gotra can trace their ancestry back to a specific individual. Now, you might say, well, how can they do this? And there's branches. They don't think about that, and people would not have thought about that. But see, that connection, that common ancestor, gives that group of families a common identity and a collective identity, because it's sort of like we're all the same because we came from this person. And each Jati then is made up of several of these lineages. Well, family life and family was and is very important in traditional Indian society, and traditionally marriages were arranged, and the girl's family was looking for a secure match that was slightly up within the Jati. Upon marriage, the bride basically loses her lineage. And like I said, the boy's family usually sought a fair-skinned bride who was considered good-looking, who was easy to get along with. The boy's family also wanted to match a fairly equal status, and they also wanted a dowry as well. Marriages between castes were strongly discouraged, to say the least, but it was more acceptable for a man to marry below his caste. If a woman married below her caste, any children from that marriage would be untouchable. So you can look at this and say, oh, it's a way to control women or whatever. It is what it is. Social relations then are governed by Jati rules and so on and so forth, and they're further regulated by very rigid ideas of purity and pollution. The Varnas were associated with certain categories of occupation, from the very pure, Brahmans, all the way down to those with very polluting jobs, the untouchables. Now, the system here allows for economic contact because we mentioned some of these other groups, carpenters and stuff like that. If you wanted carpentry work done, you went to the carpenters, and that didn't matter what your caste was. So the system allows for economic contacts, but it forbids social interaction at the personal level. So people of different castes are not going to be hanging around, socializing with one another necessarily. Traditionally, you could only eat food prepared by a member of your own caste or by a Brahmin. If your food was touched by somebody in a lower caste or by an untouchable, then it was polluted and had to be thrown out. We'll talk about Hinduism shortly. And actually, I'm going to stop this so that this isn't so long to upload, and I'll pick up on the other side with part 2, I guess it would be.